Hello, and welcome back to my series on building a square drop trailer. In the last episode, we were able to build a custom roof rack that has trailer lights and floodlights for camping at night. And in this video, I plan on having a finished and fully functional kitchen area. And to make it easier to work back here, the first thing I have to do is get rid of this ladder that I'm using to hold up the door of the rear hatch. And I'll be replacing it with these gas struts and brackets. A friend of mine was kind enough to do all the math and figure out which ones will work correctly. I'll put a link in the description below if you're looking for the same ones. After making sure the trailer is sitting perfectly level, I measured down about 3 inches on each side of the door, and then I started mounting the door bracket by drilling some holes. And after getting the bracket mounted with just one of the screws, I was able to mark out the location for the other holes and start drilling those as well, making sure not to drill all the way through the door. And after pre-drilling all the holes, I removed the bracket from the door, brought it over the workbench, applied some 3M VHB tape to the back of it. I punched out the holes where the screws go through, that way the tape doesn't bind and wrap around the screws as I put it back in, and then I installed the bracket back on the door. I repeated the same process on the passenger side of the trailer, and then I moved on to installing the struts. These are 40-pound gas struts, and I found the easiest way to install them is to first attach it to the ceiling, and then grab the next bracket and attach that one to the bottom of the strut. And this way we can kind of eyeball and hold exactly where it needs to be mounted on the side of the door frame. But before we start drilling holes, I want to make sure the top of the door is perfectly level and the bottom of the door frame is perfectly level. This is to ensure that when it closes, both struts are pushing with equal force on the left side of the door and the right side of the door. And to mark the location of the bottom bracket, it's just a simple process of swinging the bracket over, using a spring-loaded punch to mark the hole location, and then drilling it out. And after the first screw is installed, I can use the bracket as a template to drill the other holes. These holes go through the aluminum door framing and into the steel framing of the trailer, and because of that, I use the tap and machine screws to get a stronger bond. After pressing the bottom of the gas strut onto the bracket, I repeated the same thing on the other side of the trailer. And now, another big moment of the trailer build. I finally get to remove this ladder. When I was closing the door for the first time, I was a little hesitant or reluctant. I wasn't sure if the gas struts were the wrong poundage or not, and I didn't want to hear anything snap or break, so I went really slow on the first close. However, after a couple times of opening and closing it, I was confident that these are the right struts for the job. And now moving on to the next task, which is wiring the kitchen galley. In order to get access to some of the places where the wires go, I need to crawl inside the camper and remove the kick panel, which will give me access to underneath the countertop. I built this kick panel in the previous video, and I realized I never showed you the exact button head screws that I used. They have a smooth finish and give it a professional look. And now that we have access to run some of the electrical wires, I can show you the layout that I'm looking for. I'll be putting the switch for the 12-volt water pump off to the left of the sink. I'm going to use a 20-amp GFCI outlet that'll be hooked up to shore power. And then I'm going to have light switches that power both the kitchen can lights and a red LED strip for cooking when it's very buggy outside. I'm going to start by roughing in the light switches. And for that, I have to clip on the proper ends that mount to the back of the light switch. And I'll use the wires that run out of these. I'm going to go down underneath the countertop. And then from underneath the countertop, they're going to wrap up and around the side of the door frame of the rear hatch, on the top of the door frame, and then into these little puck holes that I'm cutting out of the styrofoam. I'm just using a hole saw bit and using my hand instead of using a drill to cut these out. To secure the wires into these holes, I'm using zip ties and zip tie anchors that you can get at most big box stores or online. I ran the wires for these can lights and the red LED strip in the same location, but the LED strip will be installed later on a panel that goes in the back of this wall. Next, I can rough in the outlet that'll be hooked up to shore power. I placed a scrap piece of metal behind this box before cutting it out, just in case I got a little carried away. I didn't want to chop into any wires. And then I used an oscillating saw to cut the opening for the remodel style box. And I went with the remodel box, that way later when I install the panel on this wall, the little tabs will come out and hold it nice and tight. And although not shown in the video, I ran some 12-2 Romex wire from the back of that remodel box and into the electrical panel, and then I crawled inside the camper and hooked up the breaker to that wire. I stapled the wire behind the panel and then cut off the excess Romex wire. And to finish off the rough and electrical, I crimped the end of the wires that go to the water pump and then I installed them on the switch right here. And now that the electrical is completely roughed in, I can start working on the paneling. And the first panel will be the headliner. This headliner material is left over from the interior build. In video 8 of this build series, you can see me making some of the other panels on the inside. It's a simple process of cutting the wood to the correct size, using spray adhesive to attach the headliner material to the wood. And then when I put it in place, I'm using the same techniques I used on the previous build. I'm using 3M VHB tape. Here I'm peeling off the protective layer. After the headliner was pressed into place, I moved on to the sidewalls. And these I'm using the same RV interior boards that I used on the interior of the trailer. And if you look closely right here, you'll see I forgot to remove one of the protective layers of the VHB tape. There's still tape all the way around the rest of the panel, so I'm not too worried about it. That's one of the nice things about making these videos, is I can go back in and I can see where I messed up. Not only that, I can document every sliver I get too. And after removing the sliver, I was able to press this panel into place, and then press this panel into place, and then press it in, and then eventually use a roller to roll it in. Couldn't quite figure out why it wasn't sticking very well in the middle. And then I decided it was sticking well enough. And the other side went much smoother, probably because of this step right here. And after pressing this panel into place, it was time to move on to the back wall. And the back wall is a little bit different. I'm going to be hanging some heavy cabinets on this, so I wanted the plywood to be a little bit thicker. Not only that, I wanted some foam insulation behind this plywood. Number one, to help insulate the cabinet, and number two, I'm going to be putting some tiling on it. And I want this tiling to be a nice sturdy background so the boards don't flex in the middle in between the studs. This back panel had to be cut in half in order to fit through the rear hatch. And the tiles that I'll be using on it will be the peel and stick variety. In order to get the proper adhesion, I'm rolling on some primer right now. And while the primer is drying, I thought it would be a good time to get a head start on the finish electrical part. These can lights will shine down on the working part of the kitchen, and if they're too bright, they are dimmable, just like the interior lights are. And now that the primer is dry, I can cut out the access hole for the back side of the electrical panel. And using a jigsaw off camera, made quick work of it. And then I headed back to the kitchen galley to work under the newly installed lights. I wanted to make sure that there was a secure connection between the plywood and the cabinets. So not only am I using the VHB tape, but you also saw that I was drilling and tapping holes. That way I could put a tapered machine screw into the plywood as well. And then I carried over the first sheet of plywood to install it, being careful not to hit anything. And then I set it in place, pressing it against the VHB tape. After installing the larger half of this rear panel, I installed the lighter top half. For some reason, I grunted a lot more. After pressing it in and installing the machine screws, the back panel is now done. Moving on, I can start finishing up some of the electrical. I'll start with the two light switches here. It's just a matter of hooking them up, making sure they're working. Then I moved on to the 120 volt GFCI outlet. Doing some of this electrical work, cleaned up this back panel. I got it ready to install the final panel. Technically it's the final 3 panels, but it is the back wall behind the rear hatch. And I divided it up in 3 pieces just to make it a little bit easier. Started by using some ACM paneling left over from the siding. Traced out around the door so I could make a nice cut. And after using the jigsaw, I peeled off the protective layer of the ACM panel, installed the VHB tape on the trailer. I carried it over and I pressed it into place. And then I repeated the same process on the other side. I chose to do this rear panel into 3 different pieces. One, because it was easier. The second one is I'm planning on putting these LED lights on the back. They'll be red with the intent of keeping the bugs out at night, or at least limiting the amount of bugs. And for that, it made the wiring a lot easier to put this last piece in separately. These are the same red LED light strips that I installed underneath the trailer in a previous video. And here I'm using 2 different strips. One starts in the middle of this panel. You can see that I taped the wires on the back side of it, and then the LED strips is hanging down right now. Then after I struggle to install this panel,
there we go. Please fit. Oh, thank God. Did it.
and then using the adhesive on the back of these LED light strips, I'll stick them onto the panel. Then I'll wire them in parallel to the wire that I ran earlier in this video that comes up and around the hatch.
Good.
And now that the paneling is complete, we can move on to installing some of the finishing touches. Things like cabinets, a tile backsplash, a mirror, some trim, and installing the sink and stove. Instead of building cabinets from scratch, I found a good deal on some used ones from Facebook Marketplace. They're IKEA Besta cabinets. They have a glass front, and the white matches the exterior paneling of the trailer, so I thought they'd be a perfect fit. And they just happen to be the perfect size also. They come with these metal brackets, and these brackets are bolted into the metal studs of the trailer. Then the cabinets rest on these brackets. Not only do they rest on top of the bracket, they're also mounted in with some hardware from inside the cabinet that screws into the metal brackets. So here you can see I'm installing those bolts that go through the cabinet and into that metal bracket. After the passenger side cabinet was installed, I repeated the same process on the driver's side cabinet. The glass and melamine finish of these cabinets will make it easy to clean, but there are downsides to using these IKEA cabinets. It's made out of particle board and MDF board. They're fairly heavy, and they might not be as strong as a metal or a solid wood cabinet. However, they fit perfect and they look good in the back of this trailer. Since the back of this trailer doesn't have room for larger cabinets, I decided on making a larger shelf to put on top of the cabinets. That way it can house or hold larger items. For this, I'm using the leftover plywood I had from making the back panel. And I'm going to wrap it with the leftover automotive carpet that I used on making the kick panel in the previous video. Not only will the shelf be carpeted, but the backsplash above the shelf will also be carpeted. This involves removing the cabinets that I just installed. This also gave me time to remove all the hardware, install some Loctite, and then put the hardware back into the cabinets. So if you're watching this, Justin, I appreciate the reminder, and I'll continue to use Loctite on all the hardware. Once the spray adhesive on the carpet and the backsplash became tacky, I installed the carpet, and then I used the straight edge to get a nice clean cut that goes above the cabinets. Reinstalled the cabinets, making sure to use Loctite again. And when this is done, I was able to carry the shelf over that I just built and put it in place. Next up for the finishing touches is the tile backsplash. I'll put a link in the description below of the exact tile that I used. It's a brushed aluminum tile. But it's a peel and stick on the back, with a thin layer of plastic, and then on top of the plastic that you actually see is the brushed aluminum subway tile. It comes in sheets that are 12 inches by 11 inches. If you've ever done tile work before, you know that prep work is pretty important. What I did in mine is I found the center point of the kitchen countertop, and I put the center of this first sheet right there. I ended up using a razor blade to cut around the outlet for the GFCI and the light switches. And then I used some masking tape just to hold each piece exactly where it needs to go. And once I was happy with the main layout of the tiling, I removed the masking tape, then I kept the tile sheets in order. The first thing I did was, starting on the centerpiece, I had to prep the wall, so I had to make sure there's a nice clean mating surface. And for this, I'm just using rubbing alcohol, using a cotton swab to try to clean off all the dust and fingerprints that are on the back panel. And then I removed the wax paper on the first tile sheet that I'm going to install. I did put a mark on both the countertop and right above the tile sheet on the back panel. That way I could tell exactly where the center of the tile is versus the center of the panel wall. And now it's just a matter of rinse and repeat for the rest of the tile sheets. In the very front of each tile sheet, there's a cleared layer of cellophane that's a protective layer so you don't scratch the tile in shipping. This will sometimes get in the way, so you might have to peel it back a little bit, otherwise when the tiles interlock, that cellophane might get stuck in between them. And after these main sheets were installed, it's just a matter of putting the cover plates on the outlets and light switches and making sure everything still works. And now I can start working on some of the smaller panels. I know it looks like I'm just using a razor blade and cutting it. It looks like it's pretty easy. It's actually pretty difficult to cut with a razor blade. The directions said to use a razor blade, so that's what I used. It took about a dozen different slices with the knife before it actually went through, and I was using a sharp blade. After installing the left and right side of these tiles, I started working upward. I hung the cabinets so they're exactly 13 inches above the countertop. Each one of these tiles is 1 inch tall, so I had to go through and put one extra layer of tile across the entire top. And I used the same process I did on that first sheet. I marked the exact center of the sheet of tile and the exact center of the wall and made sure everything lined up perfectly before installing this first centerpiece. And here I'm using the knife again to cut the tiles. If you cut them along the seams, it actually cuts very easy. You just have to do one cut on the outside and one cut on the inside and the piece comes right off. It's when you're cutting vertical through the actual aluminum tile that it's hard to do with the razor blade. And after all the little pieces were done underneath, I started working my way up the back wall panel. And this was done by cutting each tile one by one and then kind of working my way up the wall until I got to the very last full sheet that I was going to install. And that's when I remembered that I still had the aluminum cutting blade installed in my miter saw. Not only did it cut through it like butter, but it was also a perfectly clean cut. So if I were you, I wouldn't use a razor blade when you're doing this. I would just use the saw blade. Now that the tiling is done, we can work on installing the mirror. And for that, I'm just taking these mirror brackets and bending them a little bit to make sure that they fit over the wooden panel and the tiles. And after screwing these brackets down, I can install the mirror. The mirror I chose, I guess, is kind of like a bathroom mirror. It lights up. It runs on lithium batteries and it charges with the micro USB cable. But the main reason I chose this mirror is because of its perfect size. It fits between the cabinets and it serves as an access panel if I ever have to get to the electrical sometime in the future. Next up for the finishing touches is the trim that goes from the wall panels to the countertop. And for this, I'm just using small sticks of angle aluminum. And it was nice that the saw was already set up for it. I'm doing 45-degree miters in all the angles. And the idea here is by using this angle aluminum, is that if we do happen to spill a drink or something back here, the liquid won't leak into the cab of the trailer. In order to make it watertight, I used a 3M sealant instead of using nails to install this trim. Now that the trim is done, we'll start moving on to permanently installing the kitchen sink stove combo. And that's done by first removing the sink, and then crawling underneath. When we do reinstall it, we're going to have to hook up 3 different lines. The first one will be the propane line. This propane will permanently install onto the stove right now. but on the front of the trailer it's hooked up to nothing, so we'll have to get to that in a little bit. Besides the propane line, there's also the water supply line. You can see that I ran these in a previous video if you want to see how I ran the lines. And this is the drain that goes to the sink. The installation process starts off with a layer of silicone that goes around the opening. And then the sink is carefully lowered down into place, making sure not to smear too much of that silicone. And the next part is a two-person job. Drop down the screws, and I crawled inside of the trailer. And while I was inside the trailer and on the bottom of the hardware, my wife was up top turning the screws.
Alright, now do the next one. Go kitty corner.
And if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm from the north, and we use words like kitty corner. If you're from the south and use words like catty corner, well, you're just wrong. After installing the sink hardware, I was able to install the drain for the sink, and then the water supply line, and then the propane line. That technically goes to nowhere for now. And the last of the finishing touches to install the plastic decorative caps that go over the screws. Now before we can test the sink and stove, first I have to address the propane issue. In my original design, I was going to put the propane tanks on the side of the trailer, but I decided the extra water tanks would be better for that. And this way I could put a larger tank, a 20-pound tank on the front of the trailer versus the smaller 5 or 10-pound tanks that could go on the side. To mount the tank, I'm first going to build a flat platform. I've just taken a large sheet of this expanded metal and just welded it right to the top of the trailer frame. But I thought it would look nicer if I cut out these little inserts, folded them, and stuck them in each one of these triangles on each side of the trailer. In other words, I'm doing it the hard way, but I think it'll look better in the long run. I'm not sure if you saw it or not, but before I put this expanded metal in my DIY brake, I took the angle grinder and scored exactly where the bend should be. The metal on this mesh is a little bit thicker than what my DIY brake can handle. It just makes it a little bit easier to bend. Not only did the scoring help bend it, but I also used a section of a railroad tie as a hammer and dolly to get the 90-degree bends just a little bit tighter. The first insert I made was a little bit of a tight fit, but I was able to pound it down in there. The cardboard cutout happened to be the exact same shape, so I used that as a template and repeated the same process on the driver's side. This one was also a very tight fit, which is a good thing, because once we grind up the paint to weld these in, they'll fit perfect. I want to make a railing that goes around this front platform. It'll be the same style that the roof racks are. This railing with the platform will now create a basket. Inside of the basket will be the propane tank, but also there'll be room in front of the propane tank for things like a diesel heater or an air conditioner. This railing will get mounted directly to the trailer frame with these little tabs that I'm welding on right now. And last but not least, I didn't want the propane line to be rubbing against the sharp expanded metal, so I cut a ring out of metal, and I'm using that as a grommet, and I welded that right onto the expanded metal. After removing the paint and primer from the trailer frame, I sprayed on some weld-through primer onto this new basket, put it in place on the trailer, and then used some large scrap pieces of metal to clamp it down. That way the mesh would stay perfectly level with the trailer frame itself. After second guessing if I wore the right shoes or not, I was able to get the expanded metal welded to the trailer frame, and then I lowered the trailer. Then I was able to set the railing in place and get it welded in. Not only does this front basket look good because it matches the rest of the trailer, the railing also serves another great function. We recently took the trailer up to the Boundary Waters and we were down this narrow gravel road. We had to make a U-turn, and to do so we had to disconnect the trailer. This railing made great handles on both the left and right of the trailer, so we could easily lift up the tongue and spin the trailer around before hooking back up to the tow vehicle. And now that it's painted, we can start by hooking up the propane tank. found this propane tank bracket online. I'll put a link in the description below. Long story short, I wasn't quite happy with it. I like the way that it cinches onto the tank, but it was just too flimsy and the tank would kind of wiggle around. Since this is an off-road trailer, I want to make it a little more sturdy. So I bent some pieces of metal and I'm going to get these welded on there too. I also had to weld in some little outriggers underneath. This helps support the expanded metal. That way the new legs of this propane tank bracket will have something to mount to. And after painting everything, we can finally get the propane tank mounted so we can test out the stove and sink combo. The metal strap that actually holds the tank down is tightened down with this wing nut. And then the propane line with the built-in regulator gets attached to the propane tank. Over the top of this, we put a Camco plastic shield. The shield helps protect the propane tank, but it also helps protect the aluminum on the front of the trailer. The shield has a little door on the top that's open. This is used to help turn on and off the propane. Now that the propane is turned on, the only thing really left to do it in order to test out this sink and stove combination unit is to put some water in the tank. Besides putting the water in the tank though, I also want to get some more lighting in the kitchen area. And for that, I'm going to be using these battery powered LED light strips. It's a lithium powered battery and they're charged with USB-C cables. I like these lights because they have motion detectors, so we can put them not only underneath the cabinets, but I can also put it underneath the rear hatch door. That way in the future, if we want to sit out here with a table and some chairs, we'll have the lights right above you and the lights will shine down, making it easier to eat at night. Alright, now that the lighting is done, we can finally get to testing out this sink and stove combination unit. And now the fun part. We get to take this thing on another road trip. Here are some photos from our recent trip in the Boundary Waters that I was talking about earlier. And stay tuned for the next video as we bring this rig into the state inspection office where they give us a VIN and I'll give you a tour of the finished trailer.